Ireland's greatest hero was a monster. In the heat of battle, his body twisted inside out. One eye climbed up into his skull, and a column of black blood erupted from the top of his head. They called it the warp-spasm. And with it, he held off an entire army, completely alone. But he was not born with his name or his legend. He was born an ordinary boy named Setanta. And he earned everything on the night he killed a monster when he was still only a child. He was on his way to a feast at the hall of a smith named Culann. He arrived late, after dark. And Culann, not realizing the boy was still coming, had already let loose his guard dog for the night, an enormous, savage hound that could hold off an army all by itself. The hound came for the boy, jaws wide and ready to kill. And little Setanta, with nothing in his hands but a hurling bull and a stick, killed it. He drove the bull straight down the great beast's throat and dashed it against the ground. A child, who had just killed a monster. But Culann the smith was heartbroken. That hound had been his guardian, his only protection. Who would keep his home safe now? And so the boy made him an extraordinary offer. Until a new pup can be raised and trained to replace it, he said, I will guard your house myself. I will be your hound. And from that night on, the boy Setanta carried a new name, Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Culann. He would guard and he would kill for the whole of his short and blazing life. Because his life was always going to be short. As a boy, he overheard a druid foretell that any child who first took up arms on one particular day would win a life of undying fame, but that it would burn out fast and end young. And Cu Chulainn went straight to the king and demanded his weapons. That very day, for he was the son of the god Lugh, and there was something inside him that was not entirely human, something that came out of him when he fought. The Irish had a word for it. The riastrad, the warp-spasm. When the battle fury took him, his whole body convulsed. It spun around inside his own skin so that his feet and his knees now pointed backward. One of his eyes was sucked deep into his skull, while the other bulged out, huge, upon his cheek. His hair stood on end, and on the tip of every single strand stood a bead of blood or a spark of fire. From the crown of his head rose a thick, dark column of blood, towering up into the air like the mast of a ship, and a blinding light blazed out from his forehead. They called it the hero light. In that state, Cu Chulainn was no longer a man at all. He was a thing of pure destruction, so far gone that he could not always tell a friend from an enemy. That was the warp-spasm, and the day soon came when all of it would be needed. A great war began. They called it the Táin, the cattle raid. The proud queen of Connacht, a woman named Medba, had raised an enormous army and marched it on the kingdom of Ulster to seize its single greatest treasure, a magnificent, magical bull. But Ulster carried a terrible weakness. Long before, its men had wronged a goddess, and she had laid a curse on them. In their hour of greatest need, she swore, every warrior of Ulster would be struck down helpless, gripped by the pains of a woman in childbirth. And as Medb's army crossed the border, that is exactly what happened. Every grown warrior in the kingdom collapsed, groaning, unable to so much as lift a sword. The entire nation lay defenseless before the invaders. Every warrior, that is, except one. Because the curse did not touch Cu Chulainn. He was not fully a man of Ulster. He was the son of a god. So a single teenage boy stood between his entire helpless nation and an army that had come to destroy it. And he invoked an ancient and sacred law, the law of single combat. He challenged the army to send its champions out to face him, one at a time, at a river crossing, a ford. And he held that ford, utterly alone. Day after day after day. The army would send out its greatest warrior, and Cu Chulainn would kill him, and then the next, and then the next one after that. He bought his sleeping country precious time. and he paid for it in the blood of champion after champion. He went without sleep. He fought on, terribly wounded. Even the goddess of war herself, the Morrigan, came to him at that ford, sometimes to help him and sometimes to torment him. And still, somehow, he held. The vast army of Connacht simply could not get past one exhausted boy. Until at last, the Queen found the one and only weapon that could truly break him. She found his oldest friend, a warrior named Ferdiad. The two of them had trained together as boys. They were foster brothers. They loved one another like blood. And Medb forced Ferdiad, against his own will, to go out and fight him. The two friends met at the fort, and they fought. For 3 long days they fought, the two most evenly matched warriors in all of Ireland. And every single evening, when the fighting stopped, they would embrace each other and send food and healing herbs back and forth across the river. Because they were still friends, even now. But on the 4th day, Ferdiad began to win. And to survive, Cu Chulainn was forced to call for his most terrible weapon of all, a barbed spear called the Gay Bolg, and with it, he killed his best friend. And as Ferdiad fell, the warp-spasm drained out of Cu Chulainn entirely, and he sank to his knees in the shallow water, and he gathered up the body of the friend he had just killed, and he wept over him. It was, he said, the most terrible thing he had ever done. He had won the duel, and it had broken his heart in two. In the end, the men of Ulster finally woke from their curse and rose up and drove the invaders back out of the land. Cu Chulainn had saved them all. The boy who became a hound had held the gate of his entire nation, alone, against an army, and won. But a hero with that many slain enemies makes powerful and patient foes. The children of the men he had killed plotted for years to bring him down, and they understood that they could never beat Cu Chulainn with strength alone. So instead, they used dark magic, and they turned his own honor against him. Because Cu Chulainn lived by sacred vows, things he was bound never to do. He could never refuse a meal offered to him by a woman, and he could never, ever eat the flesh of a dog. So his enemies sent an old woman to offer him a meal by the roadside, and the meat that she offered him was dog. To refuse her would break one vow, to eat it would break the other. Either way, his great strength would begin to fail him. He ate, and he felt the power drain out of his spear hand and out of his thigh. And then, already doomed, he climbed into his chariot and rode out to his very last battle. In that final fight, he was struck a mortal blow. His enemies finally had him. But Cu Chulainn had no intention of dying on the ground, so he dragged himself, bleeding, to a tall standing stone in the middle of the field, and with his own belt, he bound himself to it, so that he would die on his feet, standing tall, facing the men who had come to kill him. And for a long, long time, not one of them dared to come near him. Even dying, even lashed to a rock, he was far too terrifying to approach. So they simply watched, and they waited, to see whether the hero light still burned around his head. And then, the goddess of death, the Morrigan, came to him one final time. She came in the shape of a great black crow, and she landed lightly upon his shoulder. And only then, only when the death crow had settled on him, did his enemies finally dare to believe that the Hound of Ulster was truly, finally gone. He had lived the exact life the Druid had promised him. Short and blinding and utterly unforgettable. A boy who killed a monster and took its name. A warrior who became a monster to save his people. A friend who was forced to kill a friend. And a hero who would not even let death itself take him sitting down. Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, who tied himself to a stone so that the very last thing his enemies would ever see was him still standing. I am Pantheon X. Until next time.